In the previous two lessons on chess strategy, we looked at time and space, and in this lesson we'll be looking at force, the third fundamental element of chess. The aim of all chess strategies and positional play is ultimately to mate the king, of course, but this rarely occurs, however, without first winning material, which then makes it much easier to launch a mating attack. Although at times even one well-placed piece working alone can win material, it is most often done with a force majority, that is, 3 against 2 or 2 against 1, which is the same as 1 against none. All pieces and pawns are not only both attackers and defenders, but they are also potential targets. Being slow of foot and unable to retreat, the pawn is the easiest piece to attack and capture. However, any piece whose mobility is compromised for whatever reason, either by being pinned or because that piece has to defend another piece, can fall victim to an attack by the enemy. In this first example, we'll be looking at a game played in 1858 by America's very first chess genius and a contender for best player of all time. His name is Paul Morphy. There are several sites where you can look at past games played as far back as over 100 or more years ago, and I highly recommend this. One site that I can recommend is called chessgames.com, and you can look at old games and games that were played just a week ago by professionals. This is very good practice so that your mind can see the combinations that are played. But we're going to go way back, 1858, and Morphy is white in this game, and he opens with pawn to e4. I'm just going to briefly explain the opening moves as it relates to the topic at hand. And black responds with pawn to e5. You know, your goal is to develop and castle, and so he develops the knight. And one general rule of thumb in chess is to develop the knights before you develop your bishops. Generally, you know, there's an exception always, depends on what your opponent does. But one reason is you're not sure exactly what the best square is for the bishop, where most of the time your best square for the knight on the king side is usually knight to f3. So this is one of the reasons for this general rule of thumb. And now he attacks the center pawn. Now there's actually a threat here. Remember, all the time, every time your opponent moves, you have to determine if he's going to win material on the next move. You have to determine what his threat is. Later we'll be looking at positional threats, but the most common threats are tactical, or the threat of losing material. So you see when white plays the pawn here, he's attacking this pawn. He's engaging this pawn, which is already attacked once by the knight, and it's only defended once by this pawn. So we're looking at a 2 against 1 situation, a force majority. Again, this is very obvious force majority, and later in the game we're going to be looking at more subtle force majorities, local force majorities. So the opponent has to respond to that, and he does it by pinning the knight, which we looked at in the tactical section of this course. So now the knight can't, like if this pawn takes and the pawn recaptures, the knight won't be able to take the pawn because the bishop will win the queen. So white captures the pawn because now there's actually a positional threat here. If this pawn takes right now, the queen would be free to capture the queen. The king would have to recapture, and black would no longer be able to castle, and that would be a bit of an advantage for white. So black sees this positional threat, so he captures the knight, and now, you know, generally you don't want to break up the pawns that are where your king is going to be castled, so he recaptures with the queen and eliminates that threat of the queen capturing the queen and the loss of the right to castle. So now he's free to recapture the pawn, but white, having the first move, is still one step ahead and develops his bishop. Now, you know, the queen was attacking this pawn. Let's back up a second. The queen is attacking this pawn once, and that's defended by the king once. Now by developing the bishop, which is something you want to do anyway because you want to castle, you should more often than not try and develop your pieces to squares where they will be creating more threats. So now we see this bishop is also attacking the pawn, so it's 2 against 1. So black has to do something quickly because that's actually a mating threat. It's not just the loss of the pawn, because when the queen captures here, the king has no escape squares. That would be mate. Here and here the king can't run. So one way of handling an attack is you can block one of the attackers. And that's what black does here. He blocks the queen's influence on the f7 pawn. And white slides over and renews the attack from another angle. Now the queen and bishop are forming a battery. This is called a battery in chess when queen or bishops are working together. And is attacking the pawn again 2 times, still defended 1 time. And the queen now slides up and helps defend the pawn, which is now defended twice. Now, the queen coming here also attacked this undefended pawn. And it looks like it could be captured now, but it can be. But you see that this pawn is also undefended, and the knight is already attacking it. And whenever you move, you always have to look at, what counterattacks your opponent can make before you make your move. Especially you want to look at the checks. So you notice that there's a diagonal here to the king, and if the queen comes here and checks the king, the queen would be forced to capture it, and then the bishop would check, and various things would happen. He'd have to run, but maybe this pawn would be lost. So right now, if this queen captures this pawn, the queen could come here and check, and then the queen would have to recapture because the queen's undefended. So white doesn't do that. He stops the check first, and now this pawn really is threatened because there won't be a check here, and the knight now is defending this pawn which was undefended. So instead, now black does defend the pawn by moving this pawn, which allows the queen to defend the pawn. This is like a discovered defense. And earlier in the tactics section we looked at discovered attacks. And now white just starts throwing all of his pieces into the battle. That's what you want to do. You want to get your pieces developed, attacking, focusing on the most important action that's taking place. And since we've already started building pressure here, white develops the bishop now, attacking the knight, which is now pinned. So this knight pinned against the queen. The knight moves. The bishop could capture the queen. And black throws an attack against the bishop, hoping to get him off of this attack against the pawn. Now notice, here's the subtle thing. This lesson is about a force majority. And there's an abstract way of looking at this as well. If you notice, this rook is undeveloped. I mean, so are white's rooks right now. But you see, black would like to castle on the king side. But now that the queen is here, this bishop is compromised. The bishop can't come out quickly so that the king can castle. Consequently, this rook is also out of play. So, in effect, black is actually playing without these pieces. So white is slowly building a force majority in the main action that's taking place here against the king. So now white feels that he can actually sacrifice material to get his other pieces into play and get into the attack. This is an advanced concept, but it's something that you can understand. You might not be able to execute it as a beginner, but you can look for this and have fun with it. Hey, it's just a game. And see when your pieces are, if you have more pieces developed in a certain area, you can actually go on the attack and try and win material. So black captures, so white sacrifices, and he throws a check in. And black blocks. Now he castles, white castles on the queen side to bring the rook in immediately. Now we have, this is how quickly attacks can develop. Both knights are pinned. This knight can't move because the king is here, and this knight can't move because of the queen. So he brings the rook in to defend, and otherwise he would probably lose the queen because he could check with the bishop, and he'd either have to recapture. Let's back up a second. He would have to recapture with the queen or the knight, and if the knight captures, then the queen would be lost. So he brings the rook in to defend. And white captures the knight, because he wants to bring his last man into play so he can have a real true force majority. And he sees also that the rook will be pinned as well, compromised. And now the last man is brought into play. Now notice, white has 4 men in the attack, and uh, black only has 3 pieces defending. So it's 4 against 3, and both of the pieces that black has in the fight are pinned. They're really compromised. See how these other 2 pieces are not in play at all? It's as if they were captured and off the board. This is one of the cool secrets of chess that I wish I had learned early in my play. So if we continue here, we see now black is really compromised, and he's got to figure out a way to get his other pieces into play. So he moves his queen, attacking the queen, hoping to relieve the pressure, trade queens, something to get out of this attack. So now he's moved here, and maybe the bishop will come out, but it's all really too late. So white captures with check, and now the knight actually is free to capture because he's relieved also the pin by moving the queen. It took care of a lot of things with one move. But unfortunately, there's a check here. And remember, from one of the earliest lessons in this course, we looked at the basic mates. And it's very, the basic mates are the fundamental threats from which all of chess is based. So if you look at the X-ray, which we also looked at X-rays in the tactics, you see that there's a rook bishop mate, which we looked at earlier. If you look through the knight, you see that if the rook were here, that would be mate because the king doesn't have an escape square. So white just simply has to check the king. I say simple, but once you see these things, they really can become simple. And now that is a mate threat. So the knight has to capture the queen because the king can't run. And now that the knight is gone, the rook slides in and it's checkmate. Really a beautiful display of getting the initiative, going on a quick attack, because the opponent didn't castle early, didn't develop. He brought his bishop out, but we're not going to be looking at that. But you see, this is how a force majority is put into play, and can either lead to winning material or mating the king, as we see in this game. Now proceed to the next lesson, where we will be taking another look at the sweet center of the chessboard.